Hi, my name's Pat Tully from the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. This evening I'm reading an essay by Leigh Hunt. Leigh Hunt was an English writer, critic, and poet who knew the likes of Charles Lamb and William Hazlitt, and who helped make famous the poetry of John Keats and Robert Browning. So the name of the essay I'm reading this evening is My Books. Sitting last winter among my books, and walled with all the comfort and protection which they and my fireside could afford me, to wit, a table of high-piled books at my back, my writing desk on one side of me, some shelves on the other, and the feeling of the warm fire at my feet, I began to consider how I loved the authors of those books, how I loved them, too, not only for the imaginative pleasures they afforded me, but for their making me love the very books themselves, and delight to be in contact with them. I looked sideways at my Spenser, my Theocritus, and my Arabian Nights, then above them at my Italian poets, then behind me at my Dryden and Pope, my romances, my Boccaccio, and then at my left side at Chaucer, who lay on a writing desk, and I thought how natural it was in Charles Lamb to give a kiss to an old folio, as I once saw him do to Chapman's Homer. At the same time, I wondered how he could sit in that front room of his with nothing but a few unfeeling tables and chairs, or at best a few engravings in trim frames, instead of putting a couple of armchairs into the back room with the books in it, where there is but one window. Would I were there, with both the chairs properly filled, and one or two more besides. We had talk, sir, the only talk capable of making one forget the books. I entrench myself in my books equally against sorrow and the weather. If the wind comes through a passage, I look about to see how I can fence it off with a better disposition of my movables. If a melancholy thought is importunate, I give another glance at my Spenser. When I speak of being in contact with my books, I mean it literally. I like to lean my head against them. Living in a southern climate, though in a part sufficiently northern to feel the winter, I was obliged during that season to take some of the books out of the study and hang them up near the fireplace in the sitting room, which is the only room that has such a convenience. I therefore walled myself in as well as I could in the manner above mentioned. I took a walk every day, to the astonishment of the Genoese, who used to huddle against a piece of sunny wall, like flies on a chimney piece. But I did this only that I might so much the more enjoy my English evening. The fire was a wood fire instead of a coal, but I imagined myself in the country. I remember at the very worst that at one end of my native land was not nearer the other than England is to Italy. While writing this article, I am in my study again. Like the rooms in all houses in this country, which are not hovels, it is handsome and ornamented. On one side it looks toward a garden in the mountains, on another to the mountains and the sea. What signifies all this? I turn my back upon the sea, I shut up even one of the side windows looking upon the mountains, and retain no prospect but that of the trees. On the right and left of me are bookshelves. A bookcase is affectionately open in front of me, and thus kindly enclosed with my books and the green leaves, I rate as if all this is too luxurious and effeminate. Of all luxuries, it is the one that leaves you the most strength. And this is to be said for scholarship in general. It unfits a man for activity, for his bodily part in the world, but it often doubles both the power and the sense of his mental duties. And with much indignation against his body, and more against those who tyrannize over the intellectual claims of mankind, the man of letters, like the magician of old, is prepared to play the devil with the great men of this world, in a style that astonishes both the sword and the toga. I do not like this fine, large study. I like elegance. I like room to breathe in and even walk about when I want to breathe and walk about. I like a great library next to my study, But as for the study itself, give me a small, snug place, almost entirely walled with books. There should be only one window in it, looking upon trees. Some prefer a place with few or no books at all. Nothing but a chair or a table, like Epictetus. But I should say that these were philosophers, not lovers of books, if I did not recollect that Montaigne was both. He had a study in a round tower, walled as aforesaid. It is true one forgets one's books while writing, at least they say so. For my part, I think I have them in a sort of sidelong mind's eye, like a second thought, which is none, like a waterfall or a whispering wind. I dislike a grand library to study in. I mean an immense apartment with books all in museum order, especially wire-safed. I say nothing against the museum itself or public libraries. They are capital places to go to, but not to sit in. And talking of this, I hate to read in public and in strange company. The jealous silence, the dissatisfied looks of the messengers, the inability to help yourself, the not knowing whether you really ought to trouble the messengers, much less the gentleman in black or brown, who is perhaps half a trustee, with a variety of other jarrings between privacy and publicity, prevent one settling heartily to work. They say they manage these things better in France, and I dare say they do, but I think I should feel more distrait in France, despite the benevolence of the servitors and the generous profusion of pen, ink, and paper. I should feel as if I were doing nothing but interchanging amenities with polite writers. A grand private library, which is the master of the house also makes his study, never looks to me like a real place of books, much less of authorship. I cannot take kindly to it. It is certainly not out of envy, for 3 parts of the books are generally trash, and I can seldom think of the rest and the proprietor together. It reminds me of a fine gentleman, of a collector, of a patron, of a Gilles Bias or a Marquis de Mariavola, of anything but genius and comfort. I have a particular hatred of a round table, not the round table, for that was a dining one, covered and irradiated with books, and never met with one in the house of a clever man but once. It is the reverse of Montaigne's round tower. Instead of bringing the books around you, they all seem to be turning another way and eluding your hands. Conscious of my propriety and comfort in these matters, I take an interest in the bookcases as well as the books of my friends. I long to meddle and dispose them after my own notions. When they see this confession, they will acknowledge the virtue I have practiced. I believe I did mention his book room to Charles Lamb, and I think he told me that he often sat there when alone. It would be hard not to believe him. His library, though not abounding in Greek and Latin, which are the only things to help some persons to an idea of literature, is anything but superficial. The depth of philosophy and poetry are there, the inmost passages of the human heart. It has some Latin, too. It also has a handsome contempt for appearance. It looks like what it is, a selection made at precious intervals from the bookstalls. Now a Chaucer at 9 and 2pence, now a Montaigne or a Sir Thomas Browne at 2 shillings, now a Jeremy Taylor, a Spinoza, an old English dramatist, Prior, and Sir Philip Sidney, and the books are neat as imported. The very perusal of the backs is a discipline of humanity. There Mr. Southey takes his place again with an old radical friend. There Jeremy Collier is at peace with Dryden. There the lion, Martin Luther, lies down with the Quaker lamb, Sewell. There Guzman de la Franche thinks himself fit company for Sir Charles Grandison, and has his claims admitted. Even the high, fantastical Duchess of Newcastle, with her laurel on her head, is received with grave honors, and not the less for declining to trouble herself with the constitutions of her maids. There is an approach to this in the library of W.C., who also includes Italian among his humanities. William Hazlitt, I believe, has no books, except mine, but he has Shakespeare and Rousseau by heart, and who, though not a bookman by profession, is fond of those biblios are, and who loves his volume enough to read it across the fields, has his library in the common sitting room, which is hospitable. H.R.'s books are too modern and finely bound, which, however, is not his fault, for they were left him by will, not the most kindly act of the testator. Suppose man were to bequeath us a great Japan chest, 3 feet by 4, with an injunction that it was always to stand on the tea-table. I remember borrowing a book of H.R., which, having lost, I replaced with a copy equally well bound. I am not sure I should have been in such haste, even to return the book, had it been a common-looking volume, but the splendor of the loss dazzled me into this ostentatious piece of propriety. I set about restoring it as if I had diminished his fortunes, and waived the privilege a friend has to use a man's things as his own. I may venture upon this ultra-liberal theory, not only because candor compels me to say that I hold it to a greater extent with Montaigne, but because I have been a meek son in the family of book-losers. I may affirm upon a moderate calculation that I have lent and lost in my time, I am 38, half a dozen decent-sized libraries. I mean books enough to fill so many ordinary bookcases. I have never complained, and self-love, as well as gratitude, makes me love those who do not complain of me. I own I borrow more books with as much facility as I lend. I cannot see a work that interests me on another person's shelf without a wish to carry it off. But, I repeat, that I have been much more sinned against than sinning in the article of non-return, and am scrupulous in the article of intention. I never had a felonious intent upon a book, but once, and then, I shall only say, it was under circumstances so peculiar that I cannot but look upon the conscience that induced me to restore it as having sacrificed the spirit of its very self to the letter, and I have a grudge against it accordingly. Some people are unwilling to lend their books. I have a special grudge against them, particularly those who accompany their unwillingness with uneasy professions to the contrary, and smiles like Sir Fretful Plagiary. The friend who helped to spoil my notions of property, or rather to make them too good for the world as it goes, taught me also to undervalue my squeamishness in refusing to avail myself of the books of these gentlemen. He showed me how it was doing good to all parties to put an ordinary face on the matter, though I know his own blushed not a little sometimes in doing it, even when the good to be done was for another. I feel, in truth, that even when anger inclines me to exercise this privilege of philosophy, it is more out of revenge than contempt. I fear that in allowing myself to borrow books, I sometimes make extremes meet in a very sinful manner, and do it out of a refined revenge. It is like eating a miser's beef at him. I yield to none in my love of bookstall urbanity. I have spent as many happy moments over the stalls as any literary apprentice boy who ought to be moving onwards. But I confess my weakness in liking to see some of my favorite purchases neatly bound. The books I like to have about me most are Spenser, Chaucer, the minor poems of Milton, the Arabian Nights, Theocritus, Aristo, and such good old-natured speculations as Plutarch's Morals. For most of these I like a plain, good, old binding, never mind how old, provided it wears well, but my Arabian Nights may be bound in as fine and flowery a style as possible, and I should love an engraving to every dozen pages. Book prints of all sorts, bad and good, take with me as much as when I was a child, and I think some books, such as Prior's poems, ought always to have portraits of the authors. Prior's airy face with his cap on is like having his company. From early association, No edition of Milton pleases me so much as that in which there are pictures of the devil with brute ears, dressed like a Roman general, nor of Bunyan as the one containing the print of the Valley of the Shadow of Death, with the devil whispering in Christian's ear, or old Pope by the wayside, and Vanity Fair with the pilgrims suffering there. I delight in the recollection of a puzzle I used to have with the frontispiece of The Tale of a Tub, of my real horror at the sight of that crawling old man representing avarice at the beginning of Enfield's Speaker, The Looking Glass, or some such book, and even of the careless schoolboy hats and the prim stomachers and cottage bonnets of such golden age antiquities as the village school. The oldest and most worn-out woodcut, representing King Pippin, Goody Two-Shoes, or the grim Soldan, sitting with 3 staring blots for his eyes and mouth, his scepter in one hand, and his other 5 fingers raised and spread in admiration at the feats of the gallant London prentice, cannot excite in me a feeling of ingratitude. Cook's edition of the British Poets and Novelists came out when I was at school, for which reason I never could put up with Sotheby's or Walker's publications, except in the case of such works as the fairy tales, which Mr. Cook did not publish. Besides, they are too cramped, thick, and mercenary, and the pictures are all frontispieces. They do not come in at the proper places. Cook realized the old woman's beau ideal of a prayer book, a little book with a great deal of matter and a large type, for the type really was large for so small a volume. Shall I ever forget his Collins and his Gray, books at once so superbly ornamented and so inconceivably cheap? 6pence could procure much before, but never could it procure so much as then, or was at once so much respected and so little cared for. His artist Kirk was the best artist, except Stoddard, that ever designed for periodical works, and I venture to add, if his name rightly announces his country, the best artist Scotland ever produced, except Wilkie, but he unfortunately had not enough of his country in him to keep him from dying young. His designs for Milton and the Arabian Nights, his female extricated from the water in the Tales of the Genie, and his old hag issuing out of the chest of the merchant Abadah in the same book, are before me now, as vividly as they were then. He possessed elegance and the sense of beauty in no ordinary degree, though they sometimes played a trip or so of foppery. I shall never forget the gratitude with which I received an odd number of Akenside, value 6pence, one of a set of that poet, which a boarder distributed among 3 or 4 of us, with his mother's compliments. That present may have been more lavish, but I hardly thought of that. I remember my number. It was the one in which there is a picture of the poet on a sofa, with Cupid coming to him, and the words underneath, "Tempt me no more, invidious love." The picture and the number appeared to me equally divine. I cannot help thinking to this day that it is right and natural in a gentleman to sit in a stage dress, on that particular kind of sofa, though no other, with that exclusive hat and feathers on his head, telling Cupid to be gone with a tragic air. I love an author the more for having been himself a lover of books. The idea of an ancient library perplexes our sympathy by its map-like volumes, rolled upon cylinders. Our imagination cannot take kindly to a yard of wit, or to 30 inches of moral observation, rolled out like linen on a draper's shop. But we conceive of Plato as a lover of books, of Aristotle certainly, of Plutarch, Pliny, Horace, Julian, and Marcus Aurelius. Virgil, too, must have been one, and, after a fashion, Martial. May I confess that the passage which I recollect with the greatest pleasure in Cicero is where he said that books delight us at home and are no impediment abroad. Travel with us, ruralize with us. I am so much of this opinion that I do not care to be anywhere without having a book or books at hand, and like Dr. Ockbohm and the novel of Camilla stuff the coach or post-chaise with them whenever I travel. As books, however, become ancient, the love of them becomes more unequivocal and conspicuous. The ancients had little of what we call learning. They made it. They were also no very eminent buyers of books. They made books for posterity. It is true that it is not at all necessary to love many books in order to love them much. The scholar in Chaucer, who would rather have at his bedde's head a 20 books, clothed in black and red, of Aristotle and his philosophy, than robes a rich, or fiddle, or psaltery, doubtless beat all our modern collectors in his passion for reading. But books must at least exist and have acquired an eminence before their lovers can make themselves known. There must be a possession also to perfect the communion, and the mere contact is much, even when our mistress speaks an unknown language. Dante puts Homer, the great ancient, in his Elysium upon trust. But a few years afterwards, Homer, the book, made its appearance in Italy, and Petrarch, in a transport, put it upon his bookshelves, where he adored it like an unknown god. Petrarch ought to be the god of the bibliomaniacs, for he was a collector and a man of genius, which is a union that does not often happen. He copied out with his own precious hand the manuscript he rescued from time, and then produced others for time to reverence. With his head upon a book he died. Boccaccio, his friend, was another, nor can one look upon the longest and most tiresome works he wrote, for he did write some tiresome works, in spite of the gaiety of his Decameron, without thinking that in the resuscitation of the world of letters it must have been natural to a man of genius to add to the existing stock of volumes, at whatsoever price. I always pitch my completest idea of a lover of books, either in those dark ages as they're called, or in the gay town days of Charles II, or a little afterwards. In both times the portrait comes out by the force of contrast. In the first I imagine an age of iron warfare and energy, with solitary retreats in which the monk or the hooded scholar walks forth to meditate, his precious volume under his arm. In the other I have a triumphant example of the power of books and wit to contest the victory with sensual pleasure. Rochester staggering home to pen a satire in the style of Monsieur Beaulieu, Butler cramming his jolly duodecimo with all of the learning that he laughed at, and a new race of book poets come up, who, in spite of their periwigs and petit maîtres, talk as romantically of the bays as if they were priests of Delphos. It was a victorious thing in books to beguile even the old French of their egotism, or at least to share it with them. Nature never pretended to do as much. And here's the difference between the two ages, or between any two ages in which genius and art predominate. In the one, books are loved because they are records of nature and her energies. In the other, because they are the records of those records, or evidences of the importance of the individuals, and proofs of our descent in the new imperishable aristocracy. This is the reason why rank, with few exceptions, is so jealous of literature, and loves to appropriate or withhold the honors of it, as if there were so many toys and ribbons like its own. It has an instinct that the two pretensions are incompatible. When Montaigne, a real lover of books, affected the order of St. Michael, and pleased himself with possessing that fugitive little piece of literature, he did it because he would pretend to be above nothing that he really felt, or that was felt by men in general. But at the same time he vindicated his natural superiority over this weakness by praising and loving all higher and lasting things, and by placing his best glory in doing homage to the geniuses that had gone before him. He did not endeavor to think that an immortal renown was a fashion, like that of the cut of his scarf, or that by undervaluing the one, he should go shining down to posterity in the other, perpetual lord of Montaigne and of the ascendant. There is a period of modern times at which the love of books appears to have been of a more decided nature than at either of these. I mean the age just before and after the Reformation, or rather all that period when book writing was confined to the learned languages. Erasmus is the god of it. Bacon, a mighty bookman, saw, among his other sights, the great advantage of loosening the vernacular tongue, and wrote in both Latin and English. I allow this is the greatest closeted age of books, of old scholars sitting in dusty studies, of heaps of illustrious obscure, rendering themselves more illustrious and more obscure by retreating from the thorny keeches of Dutch and German names into the vacant interlunar caves of appellations Latinized or translated. I think I see all their volumes now, filling the shelves of a dozen German convents. The authors are bearded men, sitting in old woodcuts, in caps and gowns, and their books are dedicated to princes and statesmen, as illustrious as themselves. My old friend Wierus, who wrote a thick book, was one of them, and had a fancy worthy of his sedentary stomach. I will confess once for all that I have a liking for them all. It is my link with the bibliomaniacs, whom I admit into our relationship, because my love is large and my family pride nothing. But still I take my idea of books read with a gusto, of companions for bed and board, from the two ages before mentioned. The other is of too bookworm a description. There must be both a judgment and a fervor, a discrimination and a boyish eagerness, and, with all due humility, something of a point of contact between authors worth reading and the reader. How can I take Juvenal into the fields, or Varagrenzius de Erisme to bed with me? How could I expect to walk before the face of nature with the one, to tire my elbow properly with the other, before I put out my candle and turn round deliciously on the right side? Or how could I stick up Uke upon Littleton against something on the dinner table, and be divided between a fresh paragraph and a mouthful of salad? I take our four great English poets to have all been fond of reading. Milton and Chaucer proclaim themselves for hard sitters at books. Spenser's reading is evident by his learning, and if there were nothing else to show for it in Shakespeare, his retiring to his native town long before old age would be proof of it. It is impossible for a man to live in solitude without such assistance, unless he is a metaphysician or a mathematician, or the dullest of mankind, and any country town would be solitude to Shakespeare, after the bustle of a metropolis and a theater. Doubtless he divided his time between his books and his bowling green and his daughter Susanna. It is pretty certain also that he planted and rode on horseback, and there's evidence of all sorts to make it clear that he must have occasionally joked with the blacksmith and stood godfather for his neighbor's children. Chaucer's account of himself must be quoted for the delight and sympathy of all true readers. And as for me, though I can but light on bookes for to read I me delight, and to hem yeva I have faith and full credence, and in mine herte have them in reverence. So hert my that there is game nona, that fro my books maketh me to gona, but it is seldom on the holy dale, save certainly when that month of May is comin', and that I hear the fowles sing, and that the flowers ginnen for to spring. Farewell my book and my devotion. From The Legend of Good Women by Chaucer. After I think of the bookishness of Chaucer and Milton, I always make a great leap to Prior and Fenton. Prior was first noticed, when a boy, by Lord Dorset, sitting in his uncle's tavern and reading Horace. He describes himself years after, when Secretary of Embassy at The Hague, as taking the same author with him in the Saturday chaise in which he and his mistress used to escape from town cares into the country, to the admiration of Dutch beholders. Fenton was a martyr to contented scholarship, including a sirloin and a bottle of wine, and died among his books of inactivity. He rose late, said Johnson, and when he had risen, sat down to his books and papers. A woman that once waited on him in a lodging told him, as she said, that he would lie abed and be fed with a spoon. He must have had an enviable liver if he was happy. I must own, if my conscience would let me, that I should like to lead half of the year just such a life, woman included, though not that woman. The other half being passed in the fields and woods, with a cottage just big enough to hold us. Dacier and his wife had a pleasant time of it, both fond of books, both scholars, both amiable, both wrapped up in the ancient world, and helping one another at their tasks. If they were not happy, matrimony would be a rule even without the exception. Pope does not strike me as being a bookman. He was curious rather than enthusiastic, more nice than wise. He dabbled in modern Latin poetry, which is a bad symptom. Swift was decidedly a reader. The Tale of a Tub, in its fashion as well as substance, is the work of a scholarly wit. The Battle of Books is the fancy of a lover of libraries. Addison and Steele were too much given up to buttons and the town. Periodical writing, though its demands seem otherwise, is not favorable to reading. It becomes too much of a matter of business, and will either be attended to at the expense of the writer's book, or books, the very admonishers of his industry, will make him idle. Besides, a periodical work, to be suitable to its character, and warrant its regular recurrence, must involve something of a gossiping nature, and proceed upon experiences familiar to the existing community, or at least likely to be received by them in consequence of some previous tinge of inclination. You do not pay weekly visits to your friends to lecture them, whatever good you may do their minds. There will be something compulsory in reading the Bamblers as there is in going to church. Addison and Steele undertook to regulate the minor morals of society, and effected a world of good with which scholarship had little to do. Gray was a bookman. He wished to be always lying on sofas, reading eternal new novels of Orbelian and Marivaux. This is a true hand. The elaborate and scientific look of the rest of his reading was owing to the necessity of employing himself. He had not health and spirits for the literary voluptuousness he desired. Collins, for the same reason, could not employ himself. He was obliged to dream over Arabian tales, to let the light of the supernatural world half in upon his eyes. He loved, as Johnson says, in that strain of music inspired by tenderness, fairies, genies, giants, and monsters. He delighted to rove through the meanders of enchantment, to gaze on the magnificence of golden palaces, to repose by the waterfalls of Elysian gardens. If Collins had had a better constitution, I do not believe that he would have written his projected work upon the restoration of literature, fit as he was by scholarship for the task, but he would have been the greatest poet since the days of Milton. If his friend Thomas Warton had a little more of his delicacy of organization, the love of books would almost have made him a poet. His edition of the minor poems of Milton is a wilderness of sweets. It is the only one in which a true lover of the original can pardon an exuberance of annotation, though I confess I am inclined enough to pardon any notes that resemble it, however numerous. The builded rhyme stands at the top of the page, like a fair edifice, with all sorts of flowers and fresh waters at its foot. The young poet lives there, served by the nymphs and the fawns. Among the old writers I must not forget Ben Jonson and Donne. Cowley has been already mentioned. His boyish love of books, like all the other inclinations of his early life, stuck with him to the last, which is the greatest reward of virtue. I would mention Isaac Walton, if I had not a grudge against him. His brother fishermen, the divines, were also great fishers of books. I have a grudge against them and their divinity. They talked much of the devil and divine right, and yet forgot what Shakespeare says of the devil's friend Nero, that he is an angler in the lake of darkness. Selden was called the walking library of our nation. It is not the pleasantest idea of him, But the library included poetry and wit, as well as heraldry and the Jewish doctors. His table talk is equally pithy and pleasant, and truly worthy of the name, for it implies other speakers. Indeed, it was actually what it was called and treasured up by his friends. Selden wrote complimentary verses to his friends the poets, and a commentary on Dryden's Polybion. Dryden was himself a reader, addicted to all the luxuries of scholarship. Chapman sat among his books, like an astrologer among his spheres and altitudes. How pleasant is it to reflect that all those lovers of books have themselves become books! What better metamorphosis could Pythagoras have desired? How Ovid and Horace exulted in anticipating theirs, and how the world have justified their exultation. They had a right to triumph over brass and marble. It is the only visible change which changes no farther, which generates and is yet not destroyed. Consider, minds themselves are exhausted, cities perish, kingdoms are swept away, and man weeps with indignation to think that his own body is not immortal. Yet this little body of thought that lies before me in the shape of a book has existed thousands of years, nor since the invention of the press can anything short of a universal convulsion of nature abolish it. To a shape like this, so small yet so comprehensive, so slight yet so lasting, so insignificant yet so venerable, turns the mighty activity of Homer, and so turning is enabled to live and warm us forever. To a shape like this turns the placid sage of Academus. To a shape like this the grandeur of Milton, the exuberance of Spenser, the pungent elegance of Pope, and the volatility of Prior. In one small room, like the compressed spirits of Milton, can be gathered together the assembled souls of all that men held wise. May I hope to become the meanest of these existences? This is a question which every author who is a lover of books asks himself some time in his life, and which must be pardoned, because it cannot be helped. I know not, I cannot exclaim with the poet, "Oh, that my name were numbered among theirs, then gladly would I end my mortal days." For my mortal days, few and feeble as the rest of them may be, are of consequence to others. But I should like to remain visible in this shape. The little of myself that pleases myself, I could wish to be accounted worth pleasing others. I should like to survive so, were it only for the sake of those who love me in private, knowing as I do what a treasure is the possession of a friend's mind when he is no more. At all events, nothing while I live and think can deprive me of my value for such treasures. I can help the appreciation of them while I last, and love them till I die. And perhaps, if fortune turns her face once more in kindness upon me before I go, I may chance, some quiet day, to lay my overheating temples on a book, and so have the death I most envy. The end. Thank you very much for joining me this evening, and have a wonderful week.